They voted me out of my own family at Thanksgiving dinner, and they were still laughing when my grandfather grabbed the microphone and told them the truth that none of them were ready to hear. Let me back up, because if I start there, you'll miss everything that matters. The years of slow poison disguised as sweetness, the smiles that were really weapons, the love that was really leverage. You need to understand what kind of people the Calloway family is before you understand what I did to them. And trust me, honey, what I did to them was surgical. My name is Alice Calloway Reeves. I'm 34 years old. I live in a brownstone in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston that I paid for with my own money, which means something in a family where money is the only language anyone speaks fluently. I have a master's degree in behavioral psychology from Tufts, a consulting firm that made just under $2 million last year, and a grandfather named Elias Calloway, who, until that Thanksgiving night, had never once told his family the full truth about who he was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the problem with this story. The ending is so good that it keeps trying to push itself to the front. You want to know the kind of family the Calloways are? Walk into their Thanksgiving dinner. Go ahead, walk into that 15,000 square foot colonial in Wellesley, Massachusetts, the one with the circular driveway and the catering staff that got hired 6 weeks in advance. Watch my Aunt Sylvia, that's my father's older sister, glide through the foyer in a cream Chanel blazer she bought specifically so she could mention it was Chanel 3 separate times before the appetizers. Watch her husband, Preston, a corporate litigator with a golf handicap he brings up the way other men bring up their children. Watch my cousins, Beau, 29, who works in finance, which means he forwards emails at his father's firm and gets a salary that would make a surgeon blush, and Tara, 31, who married a man named Ford Whitfield III, because in this family, the number after your name matters more than the name itself. Watch all of them move through that house like they own everything in it. Then look at me, standing at the edge of the room, holding a glass of Malbec, watching. That's always been my role, the watcher, the one who doesn't quite fit. My mother, God rest her, was not from this world. She was Josephine Reeves, a schoolteacher from Worcester, and when my father, Nathan Calloway, brought her home at 26, Aunt Sylvia smiled that thin-lipped smile of hers and said, "How refreshing," which in Calloway speak means, "You don't belong here." My mother knew it. She spent 20 years trying to earn her place at that table, and when she died of breast cancer 6 years ago, Aunt Sylvia wore white to the funeral, said it was a celebration of life. It was not a celebration of life. That is the family I grew up in. That is the table I kept coming back to. Here's what I've never been able to explain to my therapist, my best friend Camille, or myself. Why did I keep coming back? Why every single Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Easter brunch that smelled like mimosas and old money and quiet cruelty? Why did I keep showing up? Maybe because Grandpa Elias was always there, and Grandpa Elias was the only one who ever looked at me like I was worth looking at. But here's the thing about Grandpa Elias that nobody in that family knew. I knew. I'd known for 11 months, and I was waiting for the exact right moment. The trouble that year started in September, 2 months before Thanksgiving, when Beau called me on a Tuesday afternoon. This was unusual because Beau does not call me. Beau barely acknowledges me at family events unless he wants something or wants to make me feel small. And historically, both of those things happened at the same time. Alice. He didn't even say hello. That's Beau. We need to talk about Grandpa's estate planning. I sat back in my office chair. I was in the middle of reviewing a client proposal, and I said, "I'm sorry, what?" He's 81. Mom and Dad have been talking to his financial advisor. There's going to be a restructuring of the trust. A pause, the kind that's designed to feel casual but isn't. We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Everyone, that word. Like I was included in everyone, like I was part of the same page they were writing on. And what page is that, Beau? The page where the family assets stay in the family. Another pause. His direct family. There it was, 6 words, the blade behind the smile. I told him I appreciated the heads up. I hung up the phone. Then I sat very still for about 45 seconds, which is what I do before I make decisions that other people will regret. Here's what I knew about Elias Calloway's estate that Bo and Sylvia and Preston did not know. I knew that it was worth $63 million. I knew that the original trust, established in 1987, named only one direct beneficiary. And I knew, because I am very good at my job, which is reading people and situations that most folks would rather look away from, that there was a document in Elias Calloway's personal safe in his study that none of his children had ever been shown. I knew this because 11 months earlier, on a quiet Sunday in December, Grandpa Elias had driven himself to my brownstone, sat down at my kitchen table, and slid a manila envelope across the surface. He looked at me with those pale gray eyes that had always seen straight through every Calloway performance, and he said, "I need you to hold on to this. Not read it yet, just hold it." And then he said something that I had turned over in my mind every single day since. He said, "They think this family is what I built, but you're what I protected." I didn't ask questions. I put the envelope in the fireproof safe behind the bookcase in my home office, and I waited. That's the thing about patience. People who don't have it always underestimate the people who do. Now let me tell you what happened in October, because that's where the real game began. Tara called me the second week of October. Tara, with her highlighted blonde hair and her Nantucket house and her habit of posting photos of her kitchen renovation on Instagram with captions like, "So blessed." Tara, who had once told me at a Christmas party, with a smile, always with a smile, that she felt so sorry for me because I'd never found the right man, as if being unmarried at 34 was a diagnosis she was graciously not reporting to the authorities. "Alice, I'm reaching out because I care about you." She said it like she'd practiced it. She probably had. "There's going to be a family meeting in November, before Thanksgiving dinner. Grandpa's attorneys are going to be there, and I just want you to know, ahead of time, because I care, that we've all agreed the estate should be simplified, streamlined." Streamlined, I've repeated. It's just cleaner, for everyone. And when you say everyone, Alice, her voice got that soft, patient, "you poor thing" quality. Your mom, God, we loved Josephine, you know that, but she wasn't a Calloway, not really. And the attorneys have advised that the trust should reflect the direct bloodline. She exhaled like she was doing me a favor. "I just didn't want you to be blindsided, because I care." After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started a document. At the top, I typed 2 words: "Game on." I am a behavioral psychologist by training and a strategic consultant by profession. My entire career is built on understanding how people move, what they want, what they fear, and how to use all 3 of those things at once. The Calloway family thought they were dealing with the quiet girl from Worcester, who never quite fit. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had spent the last 11 months preparing for exactly this. I need to tell you about my mother, because she's the reason I didn't just walk away. Josephine Reeves Calloway spent 20 years in that family, 20 years of Thanksgiving dinners where Sylvia seated her at the far end of the table, 20 years of Christmas mornings where Preston made little jokes, always with that plausible deniability smile about her background. 20 years of watching her husband, my father Nathan, absorb every slight against her without once raising his voice in her defense, because Nathan Calloway cared more about his inheritance than his wife, and everyone at that table knew it. When my mother got sick, she got sick fast, 18 months from diagnosis to burial. And in those 18 months, not one person in the Calloway family offered to help pay her medical bills. This is relevant because the Calloway family had $63 million, and my mother's treatments cost $400,000, which my father quietly borrowed against the equity on their house, and which my mother spent the last 6 months of her life worrying about. I paid off that debt 6 weeks after she died. I did it with my own money. I did not tell my father. I did not want gratitude. I wanted to make sure my mother's last act on this earth wasn't owing those people something. She was the best person I've ever known, and they treated her like a guest who'd overstayed. This is not a story about grief, but it is a story that wouldn't exist without it. Now, November 15th, 1 week before Thanksgiving, the family meeting. The meeting was held at Preston and Sylvia's home in Wellesley, which is a different house from the Thanksgiving house, because yes, they have two houses, and yes, that's relevant to the story of who these people think they are. Grandpa Elias was there, seated in the high-backed chair at the head of the conference table that Preston had installed in his home office because Preston is exactly the kind of man who installs a conference table in his home office. Sylvia had clearly done her hair. Beau was wearing a blazer. Tara had brought Ford Whitfield III, who had the approximate emotional range of a decorative throw pillow. My father Nathan sat near the middle, with that expression he always wears at family events, the one that looks like calm but is actually the face of a man actively not making eye contact with his choices. I was the last one to arrive. I'd timed it that way. I wore a simple black dress, pearl earrings, and the expression I practice in my bathroom mirror when I'm preparing for a negotiation. Open, pleasant, completely unreadable. Alice, Sylvia smiled, so glad you could make it. Of course, I said. I wouldn't miss it. Grandpa Elias looked at me from across the room, just for a second. And in that second, something passed between us that I couldn't name but absolutely felt, like a signal, like a starting gun. The attorney, a man named Gerald Hopper from a firm in Back Bay, cleared his throat and began explaining the proposed restructuring of the Elias Calloway Family Trust. The language was dense, but the meaning was simple. Remove the secondary beneficiary designation, which had originally included any and all legal dependents and spouses of direct Calloway bloodline, and replace it with a primary-only structure that explicitly named Sylvia, Nathan, and their respective children, Beau and Tara. Not me. Not specifically, explicitly not me. They were too careful for that. But the new language excluded me the way a velvet rope excludes someone without making a scene about it. Clean, efficient, streamlined. I listened to the whole presentation. I asked no questions. I nodded at the appropriate moments. And when Gerald Hopper looked around the table and said, "Does anyone have any concerns?" I looked at Grandpa Elias and I said, quietly, "None at all." Elias Calloway smiled at me. It was the smile of a man with a very, very long game. I want to pause here because you need to understand something about what was really happening in that room. What they thought was happening, the family was elegantly, legally removing Alice from the picture, tying up loose ends, protecting what was theirs. What was actually happening, every single one of them had just made a move on a board where I had already been playing for 11 months. The week between the meeting and Thanksgiving, I made 3 calls. The first was to a forensic accountant named Dr. Priya Nair, who had done work for my firm before and who possessed the kind of discretion that money can buy but only character can sustain. I asked her to complete something we had started 8 months earlier, a full audit of the Calloway Family Trust's transaction history going back to 1998. The second call was to Gerald Hopper's office, not Gerald himself, his paralegal, a young woman named Sasha who had sounded during the meeting like she was one ethical conflict away from updating her LinkedIn. I did not offer Sasha anything improper. I simply asked her very politely whether she had ever heard of a document filed with the Suffolk County Probate Court in April of 2019. I gave her the case number. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll have to look into that." The way she said it told me she wouldn't have to look very far. The third call was the most important. I called my grandfather. "It's time," I said. He said, "I know." I said, "Are you sure? Because once I open that envelope..." Alice. His voice was 81 years old and made of iron. I've been sure for a very long time. I was just waiting for them to show me they hadn't changed. A pause. They showed me. I opened the envelope that night, alone at my kitchen table with a glass of red wine and my mother's photograph on the shelf across the room. I read every page, and when I was done, I sat with what I now knew for a long time, because some information doesn't just change a situation, it changes everything that came before it. The document was 37 pages. It was titled Declaration of Paternity and Amended Trust Designation, Elias Robert Calloway. I'm going to let that sit there for a second. Here's your hook. Here's the thing that keeps you up at night. If Elias Calloway was declaring paternity, and he was, clearly, explicitly, legally, then who was he declaring it for? Nathan Calloway, my father, was not Elias's biological son, which meant that Sylvia, Nathan's sister, was not Elias's biological daughter, which meant that Bo and Tara, the golden children, the ones who had just voted to restructure me out of $63 million, were not Elias Calloway's biological grandchildren. I was. My mother, Josephine, had a brother. His name was Thomas Reeves, and Thomas Reeves had a daughter, Elias Calloway's daughter, who died young, in 1989, before she could be formally recognized. And that recognition, that legal, probated, filed recognition that Elias had spent 30 years trying to get right, named one person as his sole direct biological descendant. It named me, not because of a technicality, not because of a loophole, because my mother, Josephine Reeves, was the biological daughter of Elias Calloway, the product of a long-ago relationship that Elias had kept secret to protect the family he had already built. My father, Nathan, wasn't my father in the way I'd always understood. He was my mother's husband. He was Elias's adopted son, the boy Elias had raised and loved and handed everything to. But he was not blood. I was blood, the only one. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the same way I had to sit with it. Everything I thought I knew about where I came from shifted 4 inches to the left. The woman I had mourned every single day since I was 28 years old had been, her whole life, the secret daughter of the man who sat at the head of every family table. She had married into a family, not knowing she was already in it. And Elias had watched it happen, had watched her be treated like an outsider, had watched her spend 20 years trying to earn a seat she'd been born to. I have never been angrier in my life. Not at Elias. He had his reasons, and they were complicated, and he was 81 and had been carrying this for decades. I understood, with the part of me that does behavioral analysis for a living, why a man makes the choices he makes when the truth feels too explosive to detonate. But I was angry on my mother's behalf with a cold, focused, very specific rage. Thanksgiving morning, the Calloway house in Wellesley. I arrived at 11 a.m., 90 minutes before the catering staff. I wore a deep burgundy wrap dress and the pearl earrings my mother left me. I had a leather folder under my arm. Inside the folder were 3 documents. I will not tell you what they said yet, because that's for part 2, and because some of the best things in life require a little patience. Grandpa Elias was already there, sitting in the sunroom with a cup of black coffee, and when I walked in, he stood up. This 81-year-old man who had the posture of someone much younger and the eyes of someone who had been waiting for this day for a very long time. "You ready?" I said. He reached out and put his hand on my face, the way a grandfather does, the way a father does. "I've been ready since December." By 1 o'clock, the house was full. The catering staff moved through the rooms with the choreographed efficiency of people paid to be invisible. Aunt Sylvia was in her element, managing the table arrangements, adjusting the centerpiece, introducing her new decorator to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen. Bo was at the bar, obviously. Tara was photographing the charcuterie board for Instagram. Ford Whitfield III was staring out the window with the blank expression of a man who has accepted his lot. My father Nathan found me in the hallway. "Alice," he hugged me, and it was the hug of a man who has never quite known how to hold his daughter. Too brief, too formal, like hugging an acquaintance at a networking event. Glad you came. Wouldn't miss it, Dad. He looked at my leather folder. What's that? Just some work stuff, I said. You know me. He nodded in that way that meant he didn't actually know me. I had never particularly tried. Dinner was served at 2. The table sat 14. Elias at the head, Sylvia at the foot, with all her perfectly orchestrated order in between. I was seated, as I had been seated for the past 3 years, at the far end near the window, away from the center of the conversation, proximate to the door like I might need to make a quick exit. The message was so embedded in the logistics of the room that nobody who delivered it even had to think about it consciously anymore. The food was extraordinary. It always is. The Callaways know how to perform abundance. Sylvia raised her glass. I want to start by saying how grateful we are to have this family together. She looked around the table with the warmth of a woman who has practiced warmth until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. This year has been about growth, about protecting what matters, a significant pause, about making sure this family's legacy is in the right hands. Everyone clinked glasses. Everyone smiled. I took a slow sip of wine. Across the table, Grandpa Elias was looking at his plate. The dinner proceeded. Courses came and went. Someone made a toast about the Patriots. Preston made a remark about the market that nobody asked for. Tara showed the table a photo on her phone of the renovation. Her kitchen was going to be incredible, she said. Beau laughed too loud at his own joke. My father made small talk with the woman beside him, a family friend, someone's +1, with the focused attention of a man who is more comfortable with strangers than with the people who know him. And then, between the main course and the dessert, Beau stood up. He was holding his champagne glass, he was smiling, he looked across the table at me with the specific expression of someone who has rehearsed this moment and cannot wait to deliver it. I want to propose a little toast, he said. Actually, more of a family announcement. Sylvia's smile got a little tighter. She knew. This was planned, but she hadn't approved the specific execution, and she didn't entirely trust Beau's version of finesse. We're a family that values what's real, Beau said, what's genuine. And sometimes as families grow and evolve, you gotta be honest about who's really in the circle. He looked at me. The smile widened. So we took a vote. Silence. And Alice, he raised his glass toward me, we love you, girl, we really do. But this is a family decision. And the decision is, you're not technically family. He said it like it was a joke. He said it with the delivery of someone who wanted everyone to laugh and wanted me to hear the laugh and wanted both things simultaneously. They took out their phones. Sylvia, Tara, Preston, Ford, the family friends who probably didn't even know what they were participating in. Beau got behind the group on the other side of the table. Someone said, "Smile," and they took a selfie. Without me. I did not move. I kept my face absolutely neutral. And then I stood up. I pushed back my chair. I picked up my leather folder. I turned toward the door. That is when Elias Callaway stood up. He rose slowly because he is 81 years old, but he rose completely, and when he was standing, he had the height and the presence of a man who built something from nothing and never forgot it. He reached beneath his chair and produced a wireless microphone, a small one, the kind the caterers had been using for their coordinator, and he held it up, and he tapped it once. The room went silent. "I would like," Elias Callaway said, in the voice of a man who does not require volume to command a room, "to make a family announcement of my own." He looked at Beau, at Sylvia, at Preston, at Tara and Ford. He looked at Nathan, his adopted son, who had started to go pale in the way of a man who senses that the ground beneath him is not what he believed it to be. And then he looked at me, standing by the door with my leather folder, and he said, "Sit down, sweetheart. You're not going anywhere." I sat. "Actually," he said, "and this is the moment. This is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life. He's the only one here whose blood—" Dead silence filled the room. Beau's champagne glass was still raised. Tara's phone was still in her hand. Sylvia had stopped smiling. Preston had stopped existing as a personality and become simply a body in a chair. My father, Nathan, said very quietly, "Dad, I'll be making a full explanation," Elias said, "tonight, after dessert, because I believe in feeding people before I change their lives." He set down the microphone. He looked at me, and in his eyes was everything he had never been able to say while my mother was alive. Every apology, every regret, every year of watching from a distance and loving in silence, and also something else, something that looked very specifically like the beginning of justice. I opened my leather folder beneath the table. The first document was on top. I hadn't needed it yet, but in about 45 minutes, I absolutely would. There are moments in life when the room tilts, when everything that was pretending to be solid reveals itself as paper. I had spent 11 months building toward this Thanksgiving dinner, and now I was sitting at the end of a table in Wellesley, Massachusetts, holding a leather folder in my lap, watching a family that had just tried to erase me stare at an 81-year-old man who had just redrawn every line they thought they knew. Beau's champagne glass was still raised. Nobody had told him to put it down. Nobody was saying much of anything, actually. Tara had her phone in her hand at the angle you hold a phone when you've forgotten you're holding it. Preston had developed a tick in his jaw that I recognized from the one time I'd watched him lose a negotiation. Aunt Sylvia, and I want to be very specific about this, Aunt Sylvia's face had undergone a transformation that I can only describe as a software error in a very expensive machine. The smile was still there in the muscle memory of her face, but nothing behind it was working anymore. My father, Nathan, was looking at Elias the way a man looks at the floor when it's become uncertain beneath him. And Grandpa Elias sat back down, picked up his fork, and said, "The sweet potato soufflé is excellent this year." Nobody ate the soufflé. For the next 40 minutes, the table did the thing that wealthy, controlled people do when they are in freefall. They performed normalcy. Forks scraped plates. The family friend whose name I'd never caught made a comment about traffic on the pike. Ford Whitfield III refilled his wine glass twice, which for Ford was essentially a public breakdown. Sylvia asked the catering coordinator to check on the dessert timeline with the focused urgency of a woman who needed something to manage because everything else had just stopped being manageable. I ate my dinner. I am telling you this because it is true and because it matters. I ate every bite of that meal. I had been waiting 11 months for this evening, and I was not going to waste a perfectly good plate of food over nerves I didn't have. Beau leaned over at one point and said, under his breath, "What is he talking about?" I looked at him pleasantly. "I guess we'll find out." He studied my face for a moment with the expression of someone who is starting to understand, too late, that they have been operating with incomplete information. Then he looked away. He didn't have the vocabulary for what was happening, and he knew it, and that, frankly, was already a kind of justice. Here is what nobody in that room knew about me, about the 11 months before Thanksgiving. After Grandpa Elias handed me that manila envelope in December and told me I was what he'd protected, I did not panic. I did not call a lawyer immediately. I did not make any sudden moves. What I did was think. I went for a long walk along the Charles River in the cold, with my hands in my coat pockets, and I built a map in my head of everything I knew and everything I'd need to know. Then I went to work. Here is the thing about being a behavioral consultant. You are, professionally, a person who other people consistently underestimate. Clients hire you to solve problems that feel too complicated or too human for a spreadsheet, which means your entire skill set is built around reading situations that look one way on the surface and are completely different underneath. I had spent 12 years learning to see the hidden architecture of how people operate. I had never had a more personal reason to use that skill. Dr. Priya Nair, my forensic accountant, is a methodical woman with an extraordinary eye for financial irregularities. What she found in the Callaway Trust's transaction history was not, on its face, illegal. The Callaway family had very good attorneys, and they were very careful. But careful is not the same as clean. And what Priya found, buried in a 2012 amendment to the original trust, buried in language so dense that most people would have needed 3 reads to locate the relevant clause, was a provision that had quietly shifted the trust's secondary asset pool, approximately $8 million worth of real estate holdings, into a separate LLC. The LLC was managed by Preston. The LLC had been doing business since 2013. None of the other beneficiaries had been informed. This is not what Elias had put in the envelope. This is what I found on my own, because when you start looking at a family's financial architecture with fresh eyes, you see the seams in places they stopped noticing years ago. Preston had been quietly, methodically helping himself to income from assets that belonged to the trust. Not stealing, exactly, he was too careful for stealing, more like redirecting. Over 10 years, the total amount redirected came to approximately $1.3 million. Sylvia knew. I confirmed this through a series of conversations, some direct, some not, that I will not detail here except to say that Sylvia Callaway Hartwell is the kind of woman who believes that what you can get away with is the same thing as what you deserve. She'd known since 2015 and said nothing because the money benefited her life in ways she preferred not to examine. Bo knew nothing. Tara knew nothing. My father knew nothing. This detail is important not because it excuses any of them, but because the specific shape of the weapon matters when you're deciding how to use it. The third call I'd made the week before Thanksgiving was to Sasha, the paralegal. What Sasha found in the Suffolk County Probate Court was a supplemental filing submitted by Elias's personal attorney in April 2019 that formally amended the Callaway Trust to include a previously unrecognized beneficiary. The filing had been challenged by Sylvia, through her own attorney, quietly, in the way that wealthy people challenge things they want to disappear, and the challenge had been dismissed. The amendment stood. Sasha had seen the dismissal in the court records and had not told Gerald Hopper, because Sasha was 26 years old and ethically uncomfortable and had been looking for a reason to hand in her notice for about 8 months. She handed in her notice the Monday after I spoke to her. I had offered to be a reference. Dessert arrived at 4 o'clock, and then Elias stood back up. He didn't take the microphone this time. He didn't need it. The room was so quiet that his voice, which was not loud, filled it completely. "I'm going to ask Gerald to leave," he said. Gerald Hopper, who had apparently been invited to stay for dessert in the way that attorneys are sometimes kept close when their clients are nervous, stood up immediately with the relief of a man who very much wants to be somewhere else. "And I'm going to ask the catering staff to take a break." A pause. "What I'm about to say is for family." The room cleared. 14 people remained. Elias looked at his hands on the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "In 1963, I was 20 years old, working construction in South Boston. I met a woman named Clara Reeves. She was 22. She was the most remarkable person I'd ever encountered." A pause. "I loved her. I want to be clear about that before anything else. What happened between us was not careless." Sylvia made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. "Clara became pregnant. I was 20 years old and I was terrified, and I made the worst decision of my life, which was to believe that disappearing was better than the alternative. Clara raised her daughter alone. Her daughter's name was Josephine." The room understood before he said the next part. The room understood in the way that rooms understand things that have been kept from them, with a rushing, destabilizing recognition, like a tide coming in faster than expected. "Josephine Reeves," Elias said, "was my daughter. She was Alice's mother, which means Alice is my biological granddaughter." He looked directly at Nathan, whose face had gone the color of old ash. "Nathan,
You are my son. I love you. That has never changed. But I adopted you when you were 4 years old, and I should have told you the truth 30 years ago, and I am sorry that I didn't." Nathan said nothing. He was very still in the way of someone who is being asked to reconstruct something fundamental and does not yet have all the pieces. When Josephine married Nathan, I thought about telling them both. Every year I thought about it, and every year I told myself it would cause more harm than good, and every year I was a coward. His voice didn't break, but it came close. When Josephine got sick, I told myself I would tell her. I didn't. That is something I will carry for whatever time I have left. He looked at me. The only thing I could do was make sure that Alice, that my granddaughter, was never at the mercy of people who didn't recognize her. Silence.
Then Bo said, "That's insane." He said it like a reflex, like the word had just fallen out. Elias looked at him. "Is it?" Now here is where I opened the leather folder. "I have a few things to add," I said. My voice was calm. I had practiced calm for 11 months. "If no one objects." Nobody objected. Nobody could quite locate their objections. I placed the first document on the table. I slid it toward the center where everyone could see it. This is a certified copy of the April 2019 probate filing, the one that amends the Calloway Family Trust to include me as Grandpa Elias's direct biological granddaughter and primary heir. I kept my voice even, like I was presenting a quarterly report. Sylvia, your attorneys, challenged this filing. The challenge was dismissed in June 2019. The amendment is legally valid and was valid before tonight, before the November meeting, and before any of the conversations about restructuring the trust. Sylvia's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Which means, I continued, that the restructuring proposal Gerald Hopper presented 2 weeks ago, the one designed to remove me from the beneficiary structure, was proposed against a trust in which I am already legally protected. I looked at her. I'm not sure if Gerald knew that, or if the information was kept from him, but either way, the proposal was void the moment it was made. I placed the second document on the table. This is Dr. Priya Nair's forensic audit of the Trust's Real Estate LLC subsidiary, the one Preston manages. I did not look at Preston. I am not cruel. I simply let the document sit there. Dr. Nair's analysis shows a pattern of income diversions that, over 10 years, total approximately $1.3 million. These funds were not allocated to the trust's beneficiaries. They were used for operating expenses of a separate personal entity. A pause. Preston's lawyers will characterize this very carefully, I'm sure, but Elias's attorneys will characterize it differently, and the probate court will get to decide. Preston said, "Alice, I'm not done," I said pleasantly. "Here is what I want you to understand about the third document, because this is the one that mattered most to me. The third document was not about money. The third document was not about legal strategy or trust amendments or forensic audits. The third document was a letter. It was written by my mother, Josephine Reeves Calloway, and it was dated 3 weeks before she died. I had found it in the box my father gave me after her funeral, a box of her personal papers that he'd handed over with the vagueness of a man who hadn't looked through it carefully enough. I had read that letter 100 times in 6 years. I had never shown it to anyone. Until now. "My mother wrote this letter in the last month of her life," I said. "I'm not going to read it aloud, but I'm going to tell you what it says." I looked around the table. At Sylvia, at Bo, at Tara, at my father. She writes about knowing from the very beginning that she was treated as less than in this family. She writes about the Christmas parties and the seating arrangements and the comments that were always made with a smile. She writes about the medical bills. I let that word sit. She writes that she lay awake at 3 in the morning, sick and exhausted and afraid, calculating debt. She writes that the thing she was most afraid of, not death, the debt, was leaving something behind for me to carry. The room was very quiet. She also writes that she never blamed anyone, which is very Josephine. She was a better person than almost everyone at this table, and she knew it, and she never weaponized it. I looked down at the letter for a moment. I, however, am not as generous as my mother.
I placed the letter back in the folder. Here's what's going to happen, I said. Grandpa Elias has already signed a new trust document. His actual attorneys, not Gerald Hopper, prepared it, that reflects the 2019 probate amendment. The estate will be distributed according to his wishes, which he has expressed clearly and legally and on the record. I looked at Sylvia.
Your challenge failed in 2019. Any new challenge will fail for the same reasons, and also for the additional reason that I have Dr. Nayer's audit, which creates a very uncomfortable context for Preston's legal standing as a trustee. Sylvia said, "You're threatening us." "I'm informing you," I said. "There's a difference. A threat is when I could do something and I'm warning you I will. This is different. This is me telling you that the structure you thought you were operating in doesn't exist. It never existed the way you thought it did." I looked at her steadily. "The vote you took tonight, the selfie, none of that changes anything legally. You don't have the authority to vote me out of a family I was born into." A pause. "But I'm also not interested in a war. Elias doesn't want that, and frankly, neither do I. So here's what I'm proposing." I laid out the terms. They were reasonable. They were, honestly, more generous than Sylvia deserved and slightly less generous than Preston deserved, which felt appropriate given the arithmetic of the situation. Nathan would retain his inheritance as Elias's adopted son. Elias had been clear that adoption is family, that love is family, that the legal and the emotional do not have to be in conflict. Bo and Tara would be provided for in proportion to the original trust's intentions. Preston's redirections would be handled privately, through restitution to the trust rather than legal proceedings, provided it was completed within 90 days. And the primary beneficiary designation, the one that had been filed and dismissed and filed again and was now, finally, undeniable, would stand. Tara started crying somewhere around the restitution clause. Not the dramatic crying of someone who is performing, the quiet, ugly crying of someone who has just realized that they've been participating in something they didn't fully examine, and that the participation has consequences, and the consequences are not going to be elegant. I did not feel nothing watching her. I want to be honest about that. There is a version of me that wishes I felt nothing because it would have been simpler. But Tara was not a bad person. She was a person who had inherited a culture of smallness and cruelty and had learned to perform it without questioning it. And that is a different kind of culpability than Sylvia's, which was knowing and deliberate and sustained over decades. Bo stared at the table. He didn't speak for a long time. My father, Nathan, when he finally looked up, looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. It was not guilt exactly, though it contained guilt. It was something closer to recognition, the slow, painful act of seeing something clearly for the first time and understanding that you've been not seeing it for years. He said my name, just Alice, like he was trying out what it meant. I said, "We can talk. Later." Not a promise, not a forgiveness, a door left open an inch, which is the most I could honestly offer, and I knew it. Here is what I want to say about Elias, because he deserves more than a footnote in this story. He was not a perfect man. He had been a coward in 1963 and a coward for many years after, and the cost of his cowardice was borne by a woman who didn't deserve to bear it. I know that. I have sat with that knowledge and rolled it around and found every angle of it. He cannot give my mother her life back. He cannot give her the knowledge that she was not an outsider, that she was owed a seat at that table by blood and love both. He cannot undo the Christmas seating arrangements, or the white funeral outfit, or the medical bills. What he could do was this. What he did was this. He chose, at 81 years old, to stop protecting the peace of people who had not earned it, and to protect instead the person who was the living remnant of his greatest love and his greatest failure. He sat at the head of that Thanksgiving table and said the true thing in front of everyone. That is not enough, but it is something, and I am 34 years old and a realist, and I have learned to accept the somethings without waiting for the everything. Because the everything almost never comes, and the somethings are all we actually have to work with. After the family cleared out, and they cleared out early, nobody stayed for the dessert one, Elias and I sat alone in the dining room. The catering staff was cleaning up around us, quiet and efficient, and Elias had a glass of bourbon that he was not really drinking, and I had a glass of wine that I was. The centerpiece between us was a little crooked. Nobody had fixed it. "Your mother would have hated all of this," he said. He meant the drama, the confrontation, the leather folder. "She would have made everyone coffee after and asked if they were okay," I said. "Yes," he smiled. "She was terrible at holding grudges." "I know. I didn't inherit that from her." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and it made him look younger than 81 and older than everything else in the room. "Alice," he said, "I know this doesn't fix it." "No. I know she deserved to know. She did. I'm sorry." He said it plainly, without decoration, no qualifications, no context, no defensive architecture around it, just the words. I looked at him for a long moment, at this man who was, by blood and by the longest route imaginable, my grandfather, who had loved my mother from a distance for 40 years and watched her be made small by people who had no right to make her small and had been a coward about it, and was sitting here now at 81 trying to do, finally, what he should have done decades earlier. "I know you are," I said. That is not the same as "I forgive you," but it is not nothing either. Here is what happened in the weeks after Thanksgiving, because justice, real justice, is not a single dramatic moment. It is paperwork. It is phone calls. It is a 90-day restitution timeline that Preston met at 87 days because he was scared and his attorney told him to. It is Sylvia Calloway Hartwell discovering that her husband's financial indiscretions have made her own position in the trust considerably less secure than she'd believed, and spending December in a series of increasingly tense meetings with her own lawyers that I was not present for but heard about through Elias, who was present for all of them. It is Tara calling me in late November and saying she wanted to apologize and not quite knowing how, so saying it badly, and then trying again, and still not quite getting there, but making enough of an effort that I could hear that she meant it. It is me saying, "I know," which is 2 words and also a philosophy. It is Bo doing nothing and saying nothing, which is honestly the most Bo outcome possible and which I had anticipated in my behavioral modeling.
Take a moment to comment your city or country. I love connecting with you all. Thank you for listening and supporting, and be sure to subscribe for more stories. More are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself and stay strong.